Yeah,
Yep.
great. Hey all, how are ya? It's Valerie Estes and Erin Fleming here. Welcome to the Project ALS prosetin live stream, your weekly update on our effort to deliver a promising ALS drug candidate to human trial. The drug is called prosetin. It's novel, which in business parlance means it's new, it's brand new. It hasn't been tried in people before. So today, you're going to meet the person in charge of designing the first prosetin trial for people with ALS. We're thrilled to welcome Columbia University's Dr. Jinsy Andrews to today's broadcast. But first, a quick review. And 3 reasons why we're so pumped up about prosetin as a potential ALS therapy. Number 1, it crosses the brain-blood barrier. Most drugs we've used to treat people with brain diseases from Alzheimer's to ALS haven't been able to cross that physical barrier, but prosetin can. And evidence so far suggests that prosetin stays in the brain to do its good work. Number 2, prosetin hits a therapeutic target that is relevant to ALS. The target is called ER stress. ER stress makes motor neurons sick. Prosetin's been shown to rescue stressed motor neurons, which are, as many of you know, the very cells that are targeted for destruction in ALS. And the 3rd reason we're so incredibly pumped about prosetin is that it's orally available. So it doesn't require surgeries or pumps. It's easily available orally. Now, as we've covered before the pandemic, Project ALS was well on its way to delivering prosetin to human trial in the fall of 2020, and the pandemic has knocked us a bit off track. But rest assured, our goal today and every day at Project ALS is to get prosetin to patients as soon as possible to minimize the delays. Before I hand it over to Erin and Jinsy, I want to encourage you to ask questions today. Erin, how do they do that? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit of a Luddite.
You can just submit through the Q&A box if you're live with us on Zoom. And
yeah, whatever that means, but you guys are hip. You guys are hip, you know how to do it, so do it now. I mean, our lines are open, and we really want to hear from you, especially since we have Dr. Andrews' attention today, really every day, but here's your chance to ask her questions directly. And I also wanted to mention before we get started that the pandemic has interrupted our aggressive fundraising campaign for prosetin at Project ALS. I mean, you guys have been great so far. You've helped us to raise roughly half of what we estimate it will take to get prosetin to human trial. But because Project ALS fundraising events for prosetin have been canceled, we're now relying more than ever on you and your online generosity. And we'll get to some fun news about all that later. But for now, let's make this super simple. You guys can visit prosetin2020.org and make a donation. $1, $25, $100 for you fat cats out there. Prosetin, it's PROSETIN 2020.org. I mean, times are tough, but people with ALS know from tough. Imagine the challenge of a pandemic that never ends. So we want to end it, and we need you to do it. So let's do this now, please. Give what you can, but first, or multitask. Project ALS is super excited today for our special guest. She's the starting guard for the prosetin 2020 team. She's a neurologist and ALS specialist who's built her reputation designing new kinds of drug trials for ALS. She's another game changer. She's on the prosetin team all the way. Hey there, Erin. Please let us meet Jinsy.
Thanks, Valerie. And thank you, Jinsy, for joining us today. I will just point out that Jinsy is obviously in a storage room of some sort at Columbia, where she is actually conducting clinical trial visits today, which is exciting. And we're especially grateful that she stepped out to join us for this webinar. So before I get into it and really hand it over to Jinsy to talk about some really important points about ALS clinical trial design and her approach and what we're doing for prosetin, I just want to give her formal bio, which is very impressive. So Jinsy A. Andrews is an assistant professor of neurology at Columbia University Medical Center, where she is also director of neuromuscular clinical trials. She also currently serves as the co-chair of the Northeast ALS or NEALS Consortium. And special to us, she is the director of the clinical research unit of the Project ALS Therapeutics Core at Columbia. Dr. Andrews is an expert in ALS trial design. Prior to her current position at Columbia, she was the head of neuromuscular therapeutics and senior director of clinical research and development at Cytokinetics, where she oversaw international clinical research development in ALS. Previously, she was the director of the clinical trials unit and co-director of the MDA ALS clinic at Hospital for Special Care in Connecticut, and an assistant professor of neurology at the University of Connecticut. She completed her fellowship training in neuromuscular disease and clinical neurophysiology at Columbia, and we're very glad that she came back here finally. And she's board certified in neurology, neuromuscular disease, and electrodiagnostic medicine. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So as I just mentioned, Jinsy, you have been the director of the neuromuscular clinical trials at Columbia, all of the clinical trials at Columbia for almost 4 years now. And of course, a big part of your day-to-day is seeing ALS patients as their clinician. But in terms of designing and overseeing clinical trials, can you just give everyone an idea of what that position entails and what you do in a normal day? I'm sure that's an easy question.
Thank you very much for having me today, and also thank you for the very generous introduction. Almost half my time is spent seeing patients in the clinic and providing care for patients living with ALS, but the other half of my time is really directing clinical trials. So when I first arrived here in 2016, my job was really to create an infrastructure for clinical trials, and so that has blossomed over the course of the last 4 years. I also have the responsibility of collaborating with external partners and bringing impactful clinical trials to Columbia so that people living with ALS that come in under our care at the center have access to those clinical trials, just like everybody else across the country or in North America or internationally. And then the less sexy part of my job is really oversight and compliance. And so that means when we do any kind of clinical trial, it's really an experiment. We don't know 100% how the drug is going to behave in someone's body, how safe it is, and how effective it is. So there is a lot of rigor in the staff's conduct of the study and the patient's participation in the study. And that requires a lot of oversight, a lot of inspections, and a lot of audits that we have to go through to make sure that we protect everybody's safety who's participating voluntarily in a clinical trial. And then, of course, the other part of my job is ensuring that there's sustainability. Once I build an infrastructure and we have all these clinical trials, making sure that we continue that access and broaden it, bringing all sorts of phases of clinical trials to the center, working within our center, which is really what's been the highlight of working as part of the therapeutics core through Project ALS. And the last part of it is external work in pushing research forward in ALS as a whole in a community. So I take that as a very big task, and I carry it with a lot of responsibility. So as you mentioned, I am the co-chair of the Northeastern ALS Consortium, which is a consortium of ALS clinical trial sites in North America and Europe. And I also am a board member for the ALS Association, and really it is to define and push forward the boundaries and think more creatively with the perspectives from people living with the disease and their caregivers on how to make these trials more accessible and better and more efficient.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for us, one of the really important things about Jinsy is that she wears, I hate this expression, but so many hats. They're not on right now. But I think that, we're a pretty small organization at Project ALS, and we're very good, I think, at focusing on detailed approaches to specific issues in ALS. But then, of course, the next step is to make something go, available to people across the country and the world. And I think that Jinsy's, great experience and leadership in other areas really helps us to do that. But I wanted to focus for a second on your role at the Project ALS Therapeutics Core at Columbia, because, as I said, our focus at Project ALS is making sure that we're able to identify new promising drugs, that wouldn't otherwise come to clinical trial from a big drug company and aren't already being tested and brought forward, and make sure that there's a route for them to be tested preclinically and then move to the clinic if they show promise. So what has that experience been for you? And has it sort of changed the way that you're able to bring clinical trials forward, or sort of the way that you think about clinical trials in any way?
I think one of the biggest highlights in being the director of the Clinical Research Core is that as a clinical trialist, I often deal with just the clinical trial aspect with people, but don't really get involved in the scientific development before they enter clinical trials. And there's a lot of really great science that's happening at the Motor Neuron Center.
We're having some
technical difficulties
has able to link the really bright people under the leadership of Dr. Neil Schneider and Serge Pogorski and Henrik Wichterle. Sorry. Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you.
Are we still going?
Jinsy, can you maybe turn off your video for a little while? Oh, maybe you're back now. Why don't we see if this works? And if not, maybe you'll have to turn your video off so that we can actually hear you, although we'll miss your beautiful face.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. It'll save you staring at the storage room that I'm hiding in. It's allowed me to interact as a clinical trialist with the basic science that's going on here. And so under the leadership of Dr. Neil Schneider and Serge Pogorski and Henrik Wichterle, we're able to really think critically about what are the best targets, what are the best candidates to move forward. And it actually removes the delay in that development through the basic lab. And there are aspects of basic science. I don't think people appreciate this. So when you're trying to develop something in the lab, a lot of what you want to do in the clinical trial has to be thought about really early before it even enters human clinical trials. And being able to discuss that with the basic scientists, with the people trying to optimize the compound and manufacture it and understand the behavior of the drug, it really reduces the time to the clinic, but also helps to really get an ideal development plan from basic science to human clinical trials.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear.
It's very unique. It's one of the things I think that set Columbia apart from everybody else.
So, I think we want to talk about that specifically with prosetin, but just quickly before we get into that, before you came back to Columbia, as I mentioned, you were at Cytokinetics, so a drug company that was developing treatments for ALS and overseeing basically their, clinical research from very early stage to all the way at the end. And I think that you're the only person that we know of who's an ALS clinician and clinical trialist who actually is in academia working with patients directly who has this experience in industry. Is there anything from that background or experience that you sort of bring with you as you have moved back to Columbia and you're now trying to design clinical trials in an academic, patient-facing setting?
I think the biggest value I got during that time is that I interacted with regulatory authorities. So I got a feel for what the FDA would want in a development package. And that's not only in the clinical trial setting, because when I'm working in an academic center, I only see the clinical part. But I'm able and when I'm working for a drug company, able to see what's happening in the animal studies and how they're actually developing a compound. What are the things that kind of informed the study design when they move to human clinical trials in early phase trials, and then what the regulators would want for an ALS clinical trial.
Yeah. And okay, I guess on that topic, so you're designing the clinical protocol for our phase 1 trial for prosetin, along with, our larger team with Kevin Phelan, the regulatory consultant that Valerie and I spoke with a few weeks ago. So, we talked with Kevin when we did a webinar, I think 2 weeks ago, about how we're trying to take novel regulatory approaches with prosetin, how we can take advantage of programs at the FDA that are designed for a disease like ALS, where there's just an astronomically high need for a drug that could actually be meaningful for patients. So I think the other critical side of that coin, obviously, is what you would be looking for as a clinical trialist, as somebody with experience in industry with the FDA. What do you think of in terms of a normal clinical development plan, and then how you can approach it slightly differently in a disease like ALS?
Yeah, so standard clinical development plans, once you've optimized that drug, it can take many, many years, even as long as 10 years to get to the late phase clinical trials. But it requires, once you get to humans, multiple phase 1 studies. And then once you pass that stage, multiple phase 2 studies, and then at least 2 phase 3 studies, which requires many, many patients. Doesn't always guarantee access after you've given your time and volunteer participation in those trials. So it can be pretty daunting in a standard clinical development paradigm. With ALS, and especially with my experience in industry and also with the drug development guidance, so I was part of many, many stakeholders, as you know, in developing this drug development guidance. It allowed for us to think about how serious ALS is. We all know that. It's serious, it's life-threatening. Nobody has time. Healthcare providers like myself know that there is no time, and we're trying to work with what we have. And so when designing these studies, I think some of the trouble that we have, the challenges, is that often the eligibility criteria is too restrictive, and it denies access to people who want to participate. Often there are lengthy placebo-controlled trials, and what we want to do in ALS is reduce the time that we expose people to placebo. So shorter trials with approval from the FDA. And we've seen the FDA do that with certain clinical trials in ALS already. So it's nothing new, they're moving in that direction. And then, of course, introducing open label extensions. If someone does participate in a clinical trial, then allowing them access after the trial, since they volunteered their time, that's like a principle that I really support, and I would like to incorporate into future clinical trials for ALS.
That's really cool. I'm wondering, just for the ALS 101 folks out there, could you talk about how you can envision taking prosetin from phase 1 and a first trial ahead forward? Like, if you could project ahead, what does the design really look like for people?
Well, that's a really hard question. And I'll preface it by saying that we're still learning on the basic science side of how the drug behaves, right? So in order to design a clinical trial and know how much to dose somebody and know how frequently to dose somebody requires understanding how the drug behaves, and we're doing that work now. But ideally, we would like to try to do a clinical trial, phase 1 trial, where we have a more broader eligibility criteria, and what we're primarily looking for is a safety signal, just to ensure that it's safe to proceed. With early markers of efficacy and looking to see how the drug behaves, so that that can inform a subsequent study. And last, I hope, certainly the European regulators have allowed phase 1 studies to provide open label extension for ALS patients, but I hope that we will.
Yeah, and I think that that's another really critical piece for us in having this whole team that includes Jinsy, who's leading the clinical trial design, people like Emily, who we spoke with last week, who have identified potential biomarkers for prosetin that we can now look at in people that will give us a sense of its efficacy very early on when we look in a very quick early study. And then, of course, experts who are helping to make sure that the safety, and there is in line with our clinical trial planning and our regulatory approach, and making sure that we have everything in one package, so that we're not sort of, as Jinsy said earlier, disconnected in early, in our preclinical research from what we're trying to do in the clinic. Valerie?
Oh, Erin, sorry to interrupt, but we have a few questions. We might as well start getting to those. And I'm sorry, guys, if you're not able to see Jinsy, we're having some technical difficulties. As Erin pointed out, Jinsy is coming to us from a supply closet at Columbia University where she's doing her job pretty much 24/7. But let's jump in with a couple of questions. So a couple of questions we've been getting regard inclusion criteria. So in other words, how do we qualify for a phase 1 trial in ALS, let alone prosetin? How do you answer that, Jinsy?
So I can tell you that there are some phase 1 studies that are going, and those studies are not looking for an effect on the disease progression. They're really looking for safety. And the newer studies that are they're usually shorter though, but those usually have more relaxed criteria for breathing. For example, a couple of them have a breathing criteria of greater than 50%. They don't have any stipulation for BiPAP use or PEG use, and they just need to be diagnosed with ALS, with probable or definite ALS.
Yeah, so I think as Jinsy said earlier, there has been a problem, that in ALS clinical trials where there have been sort of arbitrary, at times, inclusion and exclusion criteria. And I think that obviously this is guided by the safety in some ways, but we want to be sure as Project ALS that with prosetin, we're very careful about who we would exclude from the trial. And, it's not going to be based on the time since ALS diagnosis or something else that doesn't have a correlation with what you might expect out of the treatment. Here's another question for you, Jinsy, and I think that it's sort of impossible to answer, but we could maybe talk about some of the ways to accelerate clinical development, and some of the programs for sort of combining different phases of development in a disease like ALS here. So what is the projected time from trial to market? So I guess this question is from beginning a clinical trial to actually getting FDA approval, what kind of timeline could you be looking at?
So we did talk about the traditional standard clinical development, but I can say that that is something that is not acceptable in the ALS community, and certainly clinical trialists have tried very hard to use a couple of design implementations to make that faster. So one is that we can look at an example like gene therapy. So the SOD gene therapy that's in trials right now started as a phase 1 study, but instead of closing that study, doing a phase 2 and a phase 3, based on interim analysis, they were able to adapt that study and move it to a pivotal study, meaning that's the phase that will inform whether it gets approved or not. So we're looking at a 3 to 4 year timeline from starting from phase 1 to hopefully an approval. The other way is trying to do an adaptive design. So that means that if you're doing a phase 1 study, or actually more commonly a phase 2 study, a phase 2 study would run multiple doses. And then once the dose is selected after a certain amount of time, anywhere from 6 to 9 months, you can adapt it into a phase 3 design with no halting, so that you could come to a conclusion fairly rapidly, not the course of 10 years, but maybe 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're hoping for. We haven't achieved it yet, but we're trying to see if we can implement designs like this to kind of develop their potential therapies more quickly in the pipeline.
Yeah, and I actually have a tangential question. You mentioned that in Europe, regulators have been more open to these so-called open label extensions early in development. But obviously, even 2 to 3 years is a long time for somebody with ALS to think about a drug actually being available. So what are some of the programs that you can look at to get access to people with ALS before the drug is actually FDA approved? And how can you be aggressive about implementing those kinds of programs, or what's the best way to implement them?
Yeah, so I think that's where I mentioned that clinical research or clinical trialists that work with people and basic scientists, it's very important to have that communication very early in the development. Because what you do on the basic science side will inform how long you can dose people and provide the ability to provide open label extensions. So there's 2 ways people can gain access. So one is, or 3 ways actually. The first is the traditional way, which is through a clinical trial. The second is after a clinical trial, patients usually that are participating in the actual trial will be offered an open label extension. So this is where the patient would know that they're on drug, the physician knows they're on drug, and it can be given anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending, and it depends on the safety of the drug and the ability to provide the drug supply. So that's the first way is the clinical trial. Second way is the open label extension. The third way to obtain a drug that is not yet approved by the FDA is through expanded access. And expanded access requires the patient and their physician to make a request of the FDA. And the FDA always provides their response, usually sooner than 30 days, and then requires IRB approval, and patients are supplied the drug as long as the drug manufacturer is able to supply it.
Yeah, so actually, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but I want to talk about that point just a little bit, as long as the drug manufacturer is willing to supply it. Because in theory, Jinsy, is it true that any drug that's currently in clinical trial for ALS could be available via expanded access as long as the drug manufacturer was willing to supply it? And do you think there's a reason? I mean, there seems like there's a pretty obvious reason, but why aren't more drug manufacturers willing to supply it? I would just say before I hand it over, we've said from the beginning that with prosetin, assuming that things continue to go well in our non-clinical safety studies and then in our phase 1 study, our top priority will be offering prosetin via expanded access as widely as possible. But that's not really a common practice. And maybe you could speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah, there's multiple factors, and some are not so intuitive to understand why a drug manufacturer may provide the drug or not. And some do for ALS, do provide expanded access, and some don't. A lot of it is driven by how much drug supply you have, especially if a drug manufacturer is running an active clinical trial. They want to make sure they have enough drug to finish the clinical trial, and they don't compromise that, because at the end of the day, if you can finish a clinical trial and it shows a great magnitude of effect, you then are able to open up access to a whole slew of people in the community that have ALS. And so drug supply is one of those reasons. The second sometimes is a fear that anything that might happen in expanded access. So if someone has some sort of a safety issue or develops a medical condition, they're afraid that that might impact their development program, and the FDA may use that against them in their clinical development program. And the last is sometimes they're just not able to do it. They don't have the financial resources. So maybe they don't have drug supply because they don't have the financial resources to do it, or they haven't thought about it early enough in the development pipeline to think that they would get to that point where they're able to provide expanded access. So there's a multitude of reasons, but those are just a few.
We have a question wondering if there are any examples of expanded access programs that are currently out there. And it's probably not easy to get into in this kind of setting, but are there any resources where people could look toward expanded access programs? Jinsy, or do you recommend that they speak with their neurologist? I'm not sure how to address that in a video.
Yeah, no, this is a tough question because not all expanded access programs are required to be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. So I empathize with the person who asked that question because it's hard to find them. And usually it requires someone who's interested in accessing drug to talk to their physician, and the physician would have to ask the sponsor. And you never know. Sometimes you'll be surprised at a manufacturer's response.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think as far as we're coming at this with prosetin, just 2 quick things. One is that, Jinsy mentioned the cost of manufacturing enough drug and just having enough available for an expanded access program. And while prosetin manufacturing is by no means inexpensive to us, one advantage of it is that because it's this small molecule type of drug that's orally administered, as Valerie said, and not a biologic or a more complicated type of drug to manufacture, we can actually make large quantities of it pretty easily now that we're getting that process in place. So it makes it a little bit more straightforward from the logistical standpoint for us to have that kind of.
That's true, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that Project ALS is not a drug company. There are many reasons why we're keeping prosetin in-house for development, and Erin, you could run through those super quickly, but the great news is that if you have a question about availability of prosetin, you can just call us.
Yeah. I mean, I think as Valerie said, we want to keep prosetin in-house because we want to be able to run this program in a really humane and responsible way. We don't want it to be at the whims of external sources. We're responsible to the ALS patient community as our, investors, friends, loved ones, and family. And we want to work with you to bring prosetin forward, no one else.
That's the deal. And so Jinsy, based on what you just said, here are some more sort of concrete questions regarding prosetin and trial design. So we had a really interesting question from Paula Freund, who's in Iowa, and she goes to the University of Iowa clinic, and she's asking, it seems that prosetin, the first human trial, will be limited to a small group. When will other locations be included?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Obviously the very first in human study usually include few numbers of patients because, as all of us know, translation from animal models to humans can be tricky and not everything is predictable. And so the goal of the very first study is to understand its safety. Once we understand the safety in a small group, we can probably, and usually those studies don't take very long, anywhere from weeks to a month, we can then expand to a broader phase 2 type study, an early phase 2 study, and that can include multiple centers, theoretically anywhere from 2, 3 to about 10 centers, and we've done that in ALS for other studies. And from there, it can grow to include more patients, depending on how the drug behaves and what we see.
I think that's really helpful, Paul. I hope that helped to answer your question, because it's a question that Project ALS has fielded a lot from people who want to participate. So thanks to Jinsy, we're able to look at drug trials in new ways to make hopeful treatments more available, more widely available.
So yeah, I thought maybe I could just ask one more timely question before we let Jinsy go back to clinical trial visits. About the coronavirus pandemic. So, as everyone knows, there's been an impact on, many things in our lives from coronavirus. And we've discussed with others how, the FDA has had some changes in how they approach things, how academic preclinical research has really been impacted. But Jinsy, you're in a supply closet at Columbia today. So maybe you could talk a little bit just about how this situation has impacted clinical research, the initiation of new clinical trials, and how you and others in the field are working to try to address this and continue to treat ALS patients as soon as possible.
I think it's really important to convey that every clinical trialist in ALS feels the sense of urgency to push things forward all across Europe and North America. I'm actually in a supply closet because we have clinical trial visits occurring, and in order to take off my mask and do a video, I have to be in a room by myself with no other human being contact because of the coronavirus issue. Mm-hmm. But it is a coronavirus, and COVID-19 has impacted clinical trials, so there is a little bit of a delay in certain things that we've had to pause, but there are certainly a lot of activity in terms of collaborations with other centers, continuing to develop basic science projects, and then pushing clinical trials forward. So what I can say is that clinical trials at Columbia, and this is very specific to Columbia, there can be regional variation and institutional variation. So let me put that out front. So at Columbia, we are able to continue our gene therapies for the clinical trials with patients that were actively getting dosed and right in the middle of it. But that requires a lot of planning, a lot of resources, and trying to ensure the safety of the patient as well as the research staff. We're also able to continue ongoing patients in other clinical trials as well that use oral medications. So we're able to ship drug and do visits remotely. So For the patients that actually enrolled in our clinical trials and were actively getting dosed, we were able to keep them on their trial and keep them on their dosing without interruption, and we're very lucky to do that, privileged actually, given the situation. Where coronavirus has impacted us is that some of our new trials that just received approval in early March, or trials that were being reviewed, were delayed in terms of screening and enrolling new patients. And so we just had a discussion this morning and yesterday about ramp up plans and phasing in our clinical trials again. And a lot of other centers are doing the same. So we're fortunate. And I hope that you can sense that there is a push for continued clinical trials and research. Certainly for some of those trials, we're trying to phase in as early as June, but hopefully earlier, but in a phased method. While we're trying to get that up, we're trying to continue the work in the basic sciences and also learn. So what I'll tell you is the last thing I really want to emphasize is that we've learned so much on conducting clinical trials differently. So one is that we learned that possibly using virtual consent or remote consent may be possible, and this could alleviate so much burden for people living with the disease that want to participate in clinical trials. Conducting remote assessments and remote outcome measures, we're testing and validating those as well. And last is trying to figure out how to be flexible with visits, because I think that's one of the biggest burdens when people participate in clinical trials. They have to come into, especially our center, which is not easily accessible in the city, but trying to do clinical trials with more remote virtual visits and implementing video visits. So those things have been implemented really in response to COVID-19, but these are valuable tools that we can take forward into clinical trials when we think about designing them in the future.
That's really exciting. So gosh, it is time to kind of wrap up here. Jinsy's got to get back to work. Erin, thanks for your great questions. And Dr. Andrews, you are a beacon of hope for this community. And we're actually getting so many questions today. I'm going to go out on a limb and ask you if you're available for another live stream interview soon, because patients are really motivated to participate and learn more about what you do and about how what you do can help them. Do you have any windows for that?
Yeah, I will do my best. And I can also help in answering those questions independent of the video if you need my help for that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the questions we got, it was just so, I don't know, poetic, and it's really touched me, from Steve Hammond. So will we see this drug in this generation of ALS? And there are so many ways to think about that question, but I want everyone to know that Project ALS is committed all in to getting prosetin to human trial as fast as we can. And we want to thank Jinsy so much for kind of leading the way into the clinic. You've just been a ray of sunshine on for the whole ALS field, and we can all start to look forward to different kinds of trials, different designs, and easier access to drugs of promise. So thank you. But I also want to remind everyone who's written in today, we'll answer all your questions, but now we need your help a little bit. So just a quick reminder, for next week's live stream, we have a great guest. Her name is Dr. Lauren Black, and she works with Charles River Laboratories, which is a close partner of ours in the development of the prosetin trial. So please tune in. It's going to be fantastic. She's just a whip. And when it comes to regulatory hypotheticals, I mean, it would be fun to play some games with her on that. I don't even know what that means. But for our immediate purposes of Project ALS, you guys, this is just a reminder that you all can run your own fundraisers on Facebook. A few of you have done that, and you've raised thousands of dollars for prosetin. Please visit prosetin2020.org. Also, we're really excited not only about hosting Dr. Black on our live stream next Tuesday, the 5th, but on the 7th, next Thursday night, Project ALS is hosting a night of debauch and fun and information in the attempt to raise some needed funds for prosetin. It's called Women in the Brain. And you'll be able to find the invitation to this virtual event on the prosetin website. I'm sure there are many other ways that I just don't know how you can get to this invitation, Erin.
Everywhere on email.
Everywhere, whatever. But the thing is, we want you there because it's going to be a lot of fun, because it's being hosted by Emmy Award winners Judy Gold and Rosie O'Donnell. And we're going to laugh a lot. We're going to hear some comedy. We're also going to get some prosetin updates. And we're also going to have a signature drink. We have an event cocktail that has been devised by our new friend, Sally Stewart, Master Sommelier. And so we're going to be able to make that drink together, share that drink together, and share all of the promise that is represented by prosetin 2020. So thanks all for joining. Everyone stay safe. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Come to Women in the Brain.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.